Rain had been falling over Ashworth Park for 3 days without pause, the kind of rain that did not arrive in sheets but settled instead like a judgment, cold and patient and thorough. The gravel drive had turned to gray slick. The ornamental hedges along the eastern approach had lost their shape entirely, their edges blurred into something unintended. Inside the great house, the candles burned shorter than they should have, the damp having worked its way into the walls and from the walls into everything that depended on them. And at the edge of the entrance hall, standing at a writing table that had been pushed without ceremony against the servants' passage door, cataloging by candlelight a list of household accounts that had not been properly reconciled in 11 months, was Cordelia Ashworth. She was not a guest. She was not quite a servant. She occupied the particular position that certain households reserve for women of reduced circumstances and maximum usefulness. The poor relation, installed 3 years earlier by her uncle, Lord Ashworth, with the understanding that she would earn her keep. She had done so with such quiet efficiency that the household had expanded the meaning of the arrangement several times without expanding the terms. She now managed the linen inventory, the cook's weekly ordering, the tenant's rent ledger for the home farm, the correspondence with the wine merchant and the coal supplier, and the quarterly accounts that her uncle's solicitor, Mr. Graves, reviewed each January, with careful praise and no adjustment to her allowance. She wore a gray dress she had worn on 14 previous Tuesdays. She had counted. The ball was in the long gallery above her. She could hear it through the ceiling, the careful tread of the orchestra, the accumulated murmur of 200 guests, the rhythm of dancing that made the plaster overhead give off a fine gray powder each time the beat fell. Lord Ashworth had spared nothing for the occasion. The gallery had been dressed with hothouse flowers at a cost Cordelia had seen in the invoice and had recorded without comment. The candelabras had been borrowed from Fenwick Hall, and their transport alone had cost more than her annual allowance. The champagne had arrived in a hired wagon from London. Every chandelier in the house was lit, and none of it required her. She had ordered the champagne, confirmed the borrowed candelabras, written 3 letters to the florist, arranged the musician's schedule, and drafted the revised seating plan, when Lady Ashworth changed her mind on the 14th of the month. The evening itself, however, was not her domain. Her domain was the writing table in the hall. Her domain was the column of figures that would not balance until she found where the coal merchant had rounded up. She found it. A difference of 4 shillings and 6pence, carried forward incorrectly from October. She corrected it in ink, noted the date in the margin, and turned the page. The front door opened. She did not look up immediately. Guests had been arriving for 2 hours. But the footman who had been stationed at the door stepped back further than usual, and the particular quality of the silence that entered with the cold air was different from the usual. It was the silence of someone who did not need to be announced to be felt. She looked up. The man who had entered was tall, and carried the kind of stillness that is not natural but built. The stillness of someone who had long ago decided that the world would not read anything from his face unless he chose to put it there. His coat was dark and perfectly made, without ornament. His cravat was white and exact. He removed his gloves without looking at the footman, and handed them over with the practiced indifference of a man who had never needed to consider what would happen to his things when he set them down. The Duke of Ravenswood, Cordelia thought. Marcus Ashworth. No relation. Just the accident of a title that had once belonged to a branch of the family that had nothing to do with hers. He was here for the ball. Of course he was. Every eligible man within 3 counties was here for the ball, and this one was the most eligible of all, which meant the gallery above was likely already reorganizing itself around his eventual arrival. She returned to the accounts. But in the moment before she looked down, she registered something. He had not looked at the staircase, where the sounds of the ball above were perfectly audible. He had looked at her, not with recognition, and not with the particular dismissive assessment that men of his station usually directed toward women at writing tables in servants' corridors. He had looked at her the way a surveyor looks at a building, with the measuring attention of someone identifying something they do not yet entirely understand. The footman stepped forward to guide him upstairs. The Duke of Ravenswood turned and followed. Cordelia made a note at the bottom of the October column and continued. She had been doing invisible work in this household for 3 years, and she was accustomed to being looked at and not seen. This had been different. She did not know, yet, what to make of the difference. She picked up her pen and went on. Cordelia had come to Ashworth Park in the autumn of 1847, when she was 22 years old and had no better options. Her father had been the younger brother of Lord Ashworth, a kind man, a scholar of agricultural history, and a wholly impractical steward of his own affairs. He had died in March of that year, leaving debts she could not name for a month, because naming them had required first finding them, which had required going through 4 years of correspondence that he had filed not chronologically, but by subject, in a system whose logic had been entirely personal to him. She had spent April and May at the desk in his study in their small house in Oxfordshire, learning the extent of what she had inherited. It was not money, it was an education in the mechanics of financial collapse as seen from the inside. She had found creditors she had not known about. She had found a small insurance arrangement with a Norwich firm that her father had never mentioned, which had resolved the most immediate of the debts when she wrote to the right person with the right documentation. She had found, at the back of his largest drawer, a letter from Lord Ashworth, her uncle, offering her a position at Ashworth Park should she ever find herself in need of a home. She had written back within the week. She arrived to find the household in a state that Lord Ashworth, who was occupied with his horses and his parliamentary duties, had not noticed. The housekeeper, Mrs. Timmins, was 63, and managing an estate that had grown beyond her particular methods. The cook's ordering had been running £40 over quarter for 2 years. The tenant farm accounts had not been reconciled with the estate's own records in longer than anyone could precisely say. Lady Ashworth, who had married the title rather than the estate, had no interest in any of it, and spent her mornings writing letters and her afternoons receiving. Cordelia had not been asked to fix any of this. She had been asked to help with correspondence, but she had the same instinct her father had lacked, which was the instinct for finding where things did not match and making them match, and she could no more have walked past an unbalanced ledger than she could have walked past an unlocked door in a burning building. Within 6 months, she had reorganized the ordering system, recovered the £40 quarterly overrun, and reconciled the tenant farm accounts. She had drafted a new arrangement with the coal supplier that reduced the annual cost by £18 and added a clause requiring advance notice of price changes that the previous agreement had not contained. She had done all of this quietly, presenting her work to Lord Ashworth's solicitor, Mr. Graves, as adjustments and corrections rather than as the wholesale repair they actually were, because she had understood from her first fortnight that Lord Ashworth could be managed only if he believed nothing had been wrong in the first place. She had not done any of this from love of her uncle, who was not unkind but was entirely indifferent to her. She had done it because the work was there to be done, and because doing it well was the only ground she had to stand on, and because she had decided, in that first long April in her father's study with the creditor's letters spread across the desk, that she was not going to become less than she was, simply because circumstances had arranged themselves against her. 14 months into her time at Ashworth Park, Lord Ashworth had increased her allowance by £5 annually. He had not explained why. She had accepted it without comment. 2 months after that, he had given her the household accounts entirely, formally, by handing her the ledger at breakfast one Tuesday morning and returning to his newspaper. She had said, "Thank you, uncle," and taken the ledger, and within the hour had found an error in the September coal account that had been costing the estate 4 shillings and 6 each quarter. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition. The one person who had seen her clearly in those 3 years was not Lord Ashworth. It was Mrs. Timmins, who had said to Cordelia 3 weeks into the new arrangement, in the kitchen, with extraordinary directness, "You manage this house better than anyone in it knows, and eventually, someone will notice. I only hope it is someone worth noticing." Cordelia had thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. She thought about it again, alone at her writing table in the entrance hall, listening to the ball above her, while the Duke of Ravenswood was somewhere in the gallery being noticed by everyone. Marcus had not intended to arrive late. He had intended to arrive on time, which was to say within the first 40 minutes, which was the working definition of on time for a ducal arrival at a country ball, and he had missed this by an hour because his estate manager had sent a note that required 2 hours of correspondence to untangle. He made no apology when he arrived because a duke arriving an hour late to a ball hosted by a baron was not, in any practical sense, an event requiring apology. What he had not expected was the woman at the writing table. He had passed writing tables in entrance halls before. He had passed many women in positions of domestic management. He had not previously paused in his assessment of such a scene long enough to wonder anything at all. But there was something about this woman, the quality of her attention, the absolute absence of any performance in it, the way she had not looked up when the door opened and the cold came in, and then had looked up at exactly the right moment, when the room's particular silence told her something had changed, that caught his eye in the way that a single steady candle catches the eye in a room full of elaborate chandeliers. He had noted the gray dress. He had noted the ink on her third finger. He had noted the writing table was pushed against the servant's passage door, which meant she had been given no permanent workspace, which meant she was working around the household rather than within it. He had gone upstairs. He had spent 40 minutes at the ball, which was a handsome ball with good champagne and a great many women arranged in a great many careful presentations, and he had performed the minimum required social architecture. He had spoken to Lord Ashworth, who had been pleased and obvious about it. He had accepted a glass he barely touched and stood near the east windows, while Lady Ashworth brought 3 daughters of neighboring estates into his orbit one by one, each one carefully introduced with an emphasis on the relevant connection. Miss Hartley, who was the daughter of the Earl of Farnwick, and who was genuinely beautiful, and who understood the currency of that beauty with complete precision, had arranged herself near him for 11 minutes. He had been polite. He had not been interested. He was not indifferent to beauty. He was indifferent to the performance of it. There was a difference, and he had been navigating it since he was 23, when his mother had died, and he had come fully into the title, and discovered that the world arranged itself around a duke in ways that made it very difficult to see anything clearly. What he knew about the woman at the writing table was this: her name, from Lord Ashworth's awkward mention earlier in the week, was Cordelia. She was the poor relation, placed there to manage the accounts. She had, according to the investigation he had commissioned through his man of business 4 months ago, for reasons he had not entirely articulated even to himself, reorganized the Ashworth Park household finances without being asked, recovered a significant annual overrun, and negotiated a revised contract with the estate's coal supplier that contained a clause his own estate manager had noted with professional admiration when shown the copy. His man of business had obtained the copy because Marcus had asked him to. He had asked him to because he had encountered a version of the coal supplier's original contract in an investment dispute 2 years earlier and had found it a model of bad faith, and the suggestion that someone in a small Oxfordshire household had simply and quietly rewritten it to include protections the original had omitted struck him as the most interesting thing he had heard in 18 months. He had asked for the background of the person who had written the clause. He had been told, Miss Cordelia, a poor relation, no prospects, unmarriageable by conventional standards, has been managing this household's accounts for approximately 3 years. He had held that information for 4 months. He had then accepted Lord Ashworth's invitation to the autumn ball. He told himself it was the contract clause that interested him. He told himself he had come because the match the gossips had arranged for him, Miss Hartley of Farnwick, beautiful and well-connected, and entirely certain of her eventual success, was the sort of arrangement he could see from every angle before it happened, and that held no interest at all. He was standing in the gallery while Miss Hartley arranged her third approach when he decided he had stood in this particular room long enough. He came back down the stairs and stopped in the entrance hall doorway. She was still there. She had moved on to a different ledger. The candle beside her had burned down a third of its length. She was working with the focused stillness of someone for whom being left alone to work was not a hardship but something close to its opposite. He walked toward her. She heard him and looked up, and her face held the exact, controlled expression of someone who had learned not to show what they were thinking until they had decided what they were thinking. "You are Lord Ashworth's niece," he said. It was not a question. He had a quality of speech that made observation sound like the beginning of a longer investigation. "I am," Cordelia said. "You drew up the revised coal supply agreement, the one with the advance notice clause." She was still for a moment. "I did." "Where did you learn to read a supply contract?" She looked at him with the particular expression of a person who has been asked an unexpected question and is deciding whether the person asking it deserves the honest answer. "My father kept poor records," she said. "I learned to read them because no one else would." Marcus considered this. The advance notice clause was not in the original. No, the original allowed the supplier to adjust prices quarterly, without any obligation to inform the buyer in advance. "I thought that was unsuitable." She paused. "Was there something you needed, Your Grace?" "The ball is still in the gallery." "I am aware of where the ball is," he said. "I have been to it." He did not elaborate. She did not ask him to. After a moment he said, "Good evening, Miss Cordelia," and returned up the stairs. She stared at the ledger for 3 seconds before returning to it. The coal account was, by any measure, not what deserved her attention at this moment. She gave it her attention anyway. She brought everything she had, and she put it to work. The morning after the ball brought a letter from Ashworth Park's solicitor, Mr. Graves, announcing that the Duke of Ravenswood had been in communication with Lord Ashworth, and had expressed an interest in Ashworth Park's estate management practices. Lord Ashworth, who was not a complicated man, had responded by inviting the Duke to spend a fortnight at the estate, and to consult with whatever of the household he found useful. Lord Ashworth told Cordelia about this over breakfast. "Ravenswood wants to look at our accounts," he said, not looking up from his newspaper. "You'd better have them in order." "They have been in order since March of last year," Cordelia said. "I assume you would like me to prepare a summary." Yes, whatever he needs." Lord Ashworth turned a page. "He's brought his man of business. Roper, you'll work with him." Cordelia said that would be fine, and it would be, but she understood, in the particular way she had learned to understand things that were presented to her as something other than what they were, that this arrangement was unlikely to be entirely about the coal agreement. She was not wrong. Mr. Roper arrived a day before the Duke. He was a methodical man in his 40s, with the blunt manner of someone who had spent his career cutting through unnecessary preamble, and he looked at Cordelia's organized ledger shelves with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone who had expected to find disorder and was recalibrating in real time. "You maintain these yourself?" he said. "I do. Monthly reconciliations?" "Monthly, and spot-checked after every significant purchase over £10. He pulled out a ledger at random, the 1846 accounts, the year before her arrival, and compared it to the 1848 accounts. He spent 4 minutes doing this without speaking. Then he said, "The margin improvement in the household accounts is significant." £420 over the first 2 years, Cordelia said, approximately half from the ordering revision, the remainder from renegotiated supply agreements, and the correction of several carried forward errors. Mr. Roper made a note. "His Grace will want to review the coal agreement. I have a clean copy prepared." He looked at her again with the recalibrating expression. "How long have you been managing this?" 3 years in November." He said nothing more about it, which was itself a kind of acknowledgement. He sat down at the table she had prepared for him, and began to work, and she went to the morning room to draft the summary Lord Ashworth had requested. The Duke of Ravenswood arrived the next afternoon. His arrival was, in its way, the reverse of the ball, entirely without ceremony, a traveling coach and a single trunk, and himself coming through the front door with the same quality of not needing to announce himself that she had registered the first evening. He shook Lord Ashworth's hand. He was shown to his rooms. He appeared an hour later in the estate office where Cordelia was working with Mr. Roper, removed his coat without ceremony, and set it over the back of a chair, and sat down at the table with the assembled ledgers. "Walk me through the coal agreement revision," he said. He was speaking to Cordelia. Mr. Roper did not appear surprised by this. She walked him through it. She explained what the original contract had omitted, what she had added, and why. She showed him the 2 subsequent quarterly invoices, both of which had contained attempted price adjustments that the new clause had prevented. She showed him what those adjustments would have cost the estate annually had the original contract remained in force. He listened with his hands flat on the table and asked 3 questions, all of which were precise and none of which were easy. She answered them without difficulty because she had been managing this arrangement for 2 years and knew its particulars better than anyone. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There are 11 supply agreements currently in force at Ravenswood. I would like your assessment of them." She looked at him. He met her gaze without any performance. "I have not seen them," she said. "Mr. Roper will give them to you this afternoon." She said, "I understand." And then, because she believed in precision, "You should know that I am not a solicitor. My assessment will be that of someone who manages household accounts, not someone trained in contract law." "I am aware of what you are," Marcus said. "I am interested in your assessment." Miss Constance Hartley arrived at Ashworth Park on the 6th day of the Duke's visit, accompanying her mother on a call that was announced as a social obligation, and was understood by everyone in the drawing room to be something else entirely. She was 23, the daughter of the Earl of Farnwick, and she wore a blue afternoon dress that had been made by a London dressmaker, and had cost, Cordelia estimated from the cut and fabric, approximately what she earned in a year. Cordelia was not in the drawing room. She was in the estate office with the 11 Ravenswood supply agreements spread across the table, 3 of which she had already read closely enough to annotate in pencil. She became aware of Miss Hartley's presence at Ashworth Park because Miss Hartley, on being shown the long gallery by Lady Ashworth, walked past the open estate office door, looked in, and stopped. "You must be the poor relation," Miss Hartley said. She said it pleasantly, with a smile that had clearly been constructed to be pleasant and to mean something else entirely. "I am Miss Cordelia," Cordelia said. "Lord Ashworth's niece." "Yes." Miss Hartley looked at the papers on the table. "Are those the Ravenswood contracts?" "They are supply agreements." "Yes." "He asked you to look at them?" The smile held. "How useful." Cordelia looked at her with the specific stillness of someone who has understood both the intention and the execution of a remark, and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. "It is useful," she said. "The third agreement has a renewal clause that resets the price at the supplier's discretion. I have marked it for review." Miss Hartley's smile experienced a small but genuine recalibration. She looked at the annotated agreement, and then at Cordelia, and then said, "I see," in a tone that suggested she had seen rather more than she intended to. She walked on. Cordelia returned to the 4th agreement. She had managed worse than a beautiful woman's condescension. She had managed creditors at her father's desk, while the ink on his death certificate was barely dry. She could manage this. The supply agreements took her 3 days. She read each one twice, annotated the problematic clauses, and drafted a brief summary for each, noting what the clause permitted, what it had likely already cost the Ravenswood estate, and what a revised version might contain. She presented these to Mr. Roper on the morning of the 4th day, with the summary bound and indexed. Mr. Roper sat with the bound summary for 20 minutes, then he carried it upstairs. She did not know what happened after that. She returned to the Ashworth Park accounts and spent the afternoon on the tenant farm ledger, where she had found a discrepancy in the October field rents that turned out to be the farm manager's handwriting misread by the assistant who had copied the figure. That evening she was in the library, not working for once, but reading, because she had located, high on the far wall behind the atlas shelf, a copy of Young's treatise on agricultural improvement that she had been trying to find for 2 years and had given up on. She had been sitting in the corner chair for 40 minutes when she heard the door. Marcus had not known she would be there. He had come to find the atlas. He wanted to check the acreage maps against what the estate manager had given him, and had found instead Cordelia in the corner chair with a candle and a book, her shoes removed because she was not expecting anyone, and the entirety of her considerable professional competence set aside for the moment in favor of what appeared to be genuine absorption. He stopped in the doorway. She heard him and looked up, and there was a half-second before her expression resettled into its usual composed precision, in which he saw something that was simply a person reading a book they had wanted to read for a long time. It passed. She straightened in the chair and said, "I apologize. I did not think anyone would need the library at this hour." "Sit down," he said. "I need the atlas shelf, not the chair." She sat. He found the atlas and carried it to the reading table and spread it open. He could hear her turn a page. The fire had burned low and the room held its warmth without effort. After a few minutes, without looking up, he said, "Which of the 11 agreements concerned you most?" She did not pretend she had put the work aside entirely. The sixth, the timber supply arrangement. The pricing structure allows the supplier to invoice in advance for quantities not yet delivered, with no recourse clause if the delivery falls short. It has fallen short 3 times in 4 years. I know. I found the delivery records in Mr. Roper's files. She paused. You have been paying in advance for timber that arrived 6 weeks late, at the full contracted price, with no reduction and no penalty to the supplier. He was quiet. Then, what would you put in its place? She told him. She did not have her notes, but she had read the agreement 3 times, and she knew exactly what it said and what it did not say, and she spoke for 5 minutes with the particular precision of someone who has thought something through completely. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he said, "You should have been a solicitor." "Women are not solicitors," she said. "I am aware of what women are not," Marcus said. "I said what you should have been." She looked at him. The fire had gone down further, and the room was warm, and the atlas lay open between them, and it was not, in any sense of the word that either of them would have used, a professional consultation any longer. He was looking at her with the same measuring attention that had caught her off guard in the entrance hall, but it had shifted slightly, the way a surveyor's expression shifts when he has finished measuring and has begun to consider what he intends to build. She looked back at him without performing anything. She had learned not to perform. She had also learned that certain moments required more than professional precision, and she was not entirely sure what this one required, so she said, "I should return to my rooms," and stood, and retrieved her shoes with the particular matter-of-factness of someone who was not going to make a scene about having been caught in informal circumstances. He watched her leave. He did not call her back. He stood at the reading table with the atlas open, and made no pretense of consulting it, and after a moment, he closed it, and set it back on the shelf, and spent the rest of the evening doing nothing in particular, which was unusual for him. He had not been told the analysis of the timber agreement. He had commissioned a legal review of his supply arrangements 6 months earlier. The review had identified the timber agreement as problematic and recommended consultation with a solicitor. Cordelia had identified the same problem in 3 days, from a different angle, with more specific knowledge of the practical consequences, and had proposed a solution that the legal review had not. She had done all of this as a side task, unbidden, between the Ashworth Park accounts and the tenant farm ledger. She had delivered it bound and indexed. He had been looking for something for a long time. He was beginning to understand that he had found it, and that the finding of it was going to require decisions that were not straightforward, and that the world would not view favorably. He stood in the corridor outside the library door for a long time, long after the light beneath the door had gone out and she had clearly retired. He did not care what the world viewed favorably. He had stopped caring about that in a specific and deliberate way at the age of 23, when his mother had died and he had understood that the entire apparatus of approval and expectation that surrounded a dukedom was a machine that ran independently of whether any of the people inside it were actually living their lives. He had decided then that he would live his. He had found, in the 13 years since, that it was easier to decide than to execute. He went to bed. He woke up in the morning and told his butler that Miss Cordelia was at Ashworth Park to work, nothing more, and that the household should be arranged accordingly. He said this because he was aware that households talk, and that the talk would not be to Cordelia's advantage, and that the most effective protection he could offer at this stage was to make her position unambiguous. He sought her counsel that evening, as he had every evening. The 2 weeks passed in a pattern. Mornings, she worked on the Ashworth Park accounts and the supply agreement summaries. Afternoons, she and Mr. Roper met with the Duke to discuss the Ravenswood arrangements. Evenings, he found some reason to be in whatever room she was in. The library, the morning room, twice the estate office when she had returned after dinner because a figure was not settling. And they talked. About the agreements and then about other things. About agricultural improvement, which it turned out he had read young on as well, having done so at his mother's suggestion when he was 16. About the differences between managing a large estate and a small one. About what the advance notice clause had looked like in its first draft, which had been more aggressive than the version she had ultimately used. "Why did you soften it?" he asked. "Because a clause that the supplier refuses to sign costs you more than a clause that is slightly less than what you wanted, she said. You need the agreement to exist before you can benefit from it. He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize over 2 weeks, the expression of a man who has heard something that confirms what he had already suspected. It was not a comfortable expression to receive, because it suggested he had suspected it for some time and had been waiting to see if she would live up to what he had concluded. She was not, by nature, a woman who worried about living up to other people's conclusions. She had built her survival on her own standards, not on borrowed ones. But she found, as the fortnight drew to its close, that his assessment of her was not something she was entirely indifferent to, and she thought about what Mrs. Timmins had said. I only hope it is someone worth noticing. Miss Hartley's mother contrived a second call on the 8th day, and Miss Hartley herself managed to encounter the Duke in the garden on the afternoon of the 9th, which was either coincidence or planning, and either way demonstrated a tactical proficiency that Cordelia respected without warmth. She had been in the garden herself that afternoon, at the far end of the herb beds, taking the air because she had been at the accounts for 4 hours and her eyes needed the distance. She had watched, without meaning to, as Miss Hartley made her elegant approach across the south lawn, and she had thought, this is the woman his world has arranged for him. Beautiful, connected, entirely able to perform the role. The world's arrangement was correct, by the rules of the world. She had returned inside before she was noticed and gone back to the accounts. 2 days before the Duke's visit was scheduled to end, Lord Ashworth's brother-in-law arrived. This was Sir Edmund Farrow, who held a minor title and a significant opinion of his own judgment, and who had been, Cordelia had gathered from 3 years of household intelligence, one of the principal voices advocating for Lord Ashworth's financial decisions in the years before her arrival, decisions that had been, in the main, responsible for the condition she had arrived to correct. He had driven over from his property 16 miles distant upon hearing that the Duke of Ravenswood was resident at Ashworth Park. He sat with Lord Ashworth and the Duke in the study for 2 hours. Cordelia was not present. She heard about it afterward from Mrs. Timmins, who had a reliable channel through the footman who served the study. Sir Edmund had suggested, apparently at length, that a practical arrangement between the Ravenswood estate and the Ashworth holdings, a formal consultancy, managed through proper professional channels, would serve better than the current informal arrangement. He had proposed his nephew for the role. His nephew was, he had noted, a trained solicitor with a thorough knowledge of estate management. He had not named Cordelia. He had described the current arrangement as a temporary informal consultation by household staff, and had expressed, with patrician benevolence, some concern about the precedent it set. The Duke had listened without comment. Cordelia learned this at 7 in the evening. By 8 she had made her decision, which was the same decision she made in April 1847, in her father's study. She was not going to step aside for anyone. She was in the estate office with the supply agreements spread before her, when Marcus came in at 8:30, without ceremony, and sat down across from her. You have heard about the meeting, he said. I have. And? She looked up from the papers. I have finished the analysis of all 11 agreements. I have also drafted a proposed revision to 4 of them. I intend to have the revised drafts complete before I leave this room tonight. She paused. If you intend to hire Sir Edmund's nephew, I suggest you wait until you have those drafts. It will give you a baseline for comparison. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I am not going to hire Sir Edmund's nephew. She held his gaze. I did not assume, she said carefully. No, he said. You did not. He reached across the table and picked up the timber agreement draft she had been working on. He read it without speaking. After a minute, he set it down and said, The damages clause is new. The original had none. I added one. What did you base the figures on? The 3 late deliveries over 4 years, multiplied by the storage and alternative sourcing costs I found in the Ravenswood records, Mr. Roper brought. It is what the late deliveries actually cost you. He was quiet. She returned to the draft in front of her. The lamp on the table between them burned steadily. Outside, the rain had started again. After a time, he said, My mother managed Ravenswood for 18 months after my father died, before I came of age. She kept accounts the way you do, Annotated. Specific. No one ever credited her for it. Cordelia set down her pen. She did not speak immediately, because she understood this was not a casual remark. "What happened to the accounts?" she asked finally. "The new estate manager reorganized them when I took over. He considered them informal." She pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the table, a small gesture that was not entirely professional, and not entirely not. "That was a loss," she said. "Yes," Marcus said. "It was." He did not say anything further. He stayed until 10 o'clock, reading the supply agreement revisions as she completed them, asking questions when he had them. At 10, she finished the last one and gathered them into a clean pile and set them in the folder Mr. Roper used. She stood and stretched her back, because 4 hours at a writing table is 4 hours at a writing table regardless of who is sitting across from it. Marcus stood as well, and in the movement from sitting to standing, he was closer to her than the professional arrangement of the evening had accounted for. She registered this without retreating from it. His cravat, she noticed at this proximity, had been slightly off-center since the afternoon. She had been looking at it across the table for 2 hours, and had said nothing, because it was not her place. She said it now. "Your cravat has been crooked since at least 3 o'clock." He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has just been surprised by something small. "Has it?" "It has." She reached up without ceremony and made the small adjustment, her fingers working with the same quiet competence she brought to everything, and then stepped back. The whole exchange lasted 4 seconds, and neither of them remarked on it. He looked at her for a moment longer than the occasion required. Then he picked up his coat from the chair and went to the door, and stopped with his hand on the frame, and said, "I would like you to come to Ravenswood." She was still. "In what capacity?" "That is something we should discuss properly," he said. "When you have slept and I have not just spent 4 hours watching you work." He went. She stood in the estate office with the supply agreements in their folder and the lamp burning down, and said nothing at all, and after a moment she picked up her pen, capped it, set it in the stand, and went to bed. She had managed creditors and coal suppliers and a household that had been quietly failing for years. She could manage this. Whether she could manage what it might mean was a different question, and she allowed herself, in the particular privacy of her own room, to ask it. The formal inquiry happened because Sir Edmund Farrow had a greater talent for miscalculation than Cordelia had credited him with. He had gone from the meeting with Lord Ashworth directly to 2 other landowners in the county, the Earl of Farnwick, who was Miss Hartley's father, and the Viscount Crowe, who sat on the board of the Northern Agricultural Investment Society, and had suggested, in the careful language of a man who wishes to damage without appearing to, that the Duke of Ravenswood had been managed into a compromising informal arrangement by a household dependent with no professional credentials, and that the investment decisions rumored to follow from this arrangement ought to be reviewed before they were formalized. The Northern Agricultural Investment Society had, in fact, been in discussion with the Ravenswood estate about a significant partnership, a land improvement scheme covering 4 counties, with Ravenswood as the anchor investor. This had been in negotiation for 8 months. The partnership agreement was worth a great deal to everyone who would benefit from it, and the board had been expecting to finalize terms at their December meeting. Sir Edmund's remarks, carried by Viscount Crowe to the 3 other board members, had delayed the meeting. The board requested a formal presentation of the Ravenswood estate's management practices and the basis for the proposed investment decisions. This was, in effect, a reconsideration of Marcus's credibility as a partner. It was also because 3 of the 5 board members had heard the specific version of events that placed Cordelia at the center, a reconsideration of whether the Duke had been, as Sir Edmund had delicately implied, making decisions under unsuitable influence. Marcus received the request and sent Cordelia a letter. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first explained the situation. The second said that he intended to present to the board and would like her to attend as a consultant, and that the presentation would require the supply agreement analysis and the estate management summaries she had compiled. The third said, "I will understand if you decline." She read the letter twice. She thought about it for the length of time it took to drink her morning tea, which was approximately 12 minutes. Then she wrote back, "I will attend." She spent the week before the December board meeting doing what she always did when she was preparing for something that mattered. She went through every document she had and every document she could obtain, and she built the case from the ground up. She did not build it as an argument. She built it as a set of facts, organized in sequence, each one supported by a figure or a record or a dated entry in a ledger, because she had understood from her first year at Ashworth Park that facts organized by a woman in front of men who do not want to believe her need to be arranged with more precision than the same facts would require from anyone else. The presentation summary ran to 14 pages. It covered the supply agreement analysis, the proposed revisions, the projected annual savings, and a section at the end that cross-referenced the Ravenswood estate management figures with the 5 comparable estates in the region, and showed, line by line, where Ravenswood's current arrangements were underperforming and what the land improvement scheme was projected to produce. She did not write herself into the document. She wrote the work. The Northern Agricultural Investment Society met at Farlington House on the 14th of December, in a paneled room that had been designed to feel like a place where serious things happened, and where people like Cordelia were not supposed to stand. There were 5 board members. There was Viscount Crowe, who was the source of Sir Edmund's concerns. There was Lord Farnwick, who was Miss Hartley's father, and who had his own reasons for the outcome he preferred. And there were 3 others, a retired county banker named Whitmore, a magistrate named Aldcroft, and a landowner named Greaves, who had not, as far as Cordelia could determine, any prior investment in the outcome. She and Marcus had arrived together, which was itself a statement. He had said nothing about how they should arrive. He had simply been at the coach at the appointed hour, and she had been there as well, and they had ridden 14 miles in the particular silence of 2 people who have spent enough time working alongside each other that silence is not discomfort, but something more like agreement. She had the summary in a leather folder. She had her pencil. She was wearing the blue dress, which was not the gray one, because Mrs. Timmins had said, "Wear the blue one, Cordelia," and Cordelia had thought about it and agreed. The room was as she had imagined it. Lord Farnwick was seated at the center of the board table and had the expression of a man who was certain of the outcome. Viscount Crowe was beside him, with the careful arrangement of a man who wished to appear neutral. The other 3 were less legible. Marcus introduced her without elaboration. Miss Cordelia has been managing the Ashworth Park estate accounts for 3 years, and conducted the supply agreement analysis that informs this presentation. She will present the findings. Lord Farnwick looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has already decided the result and is performing the form of openness as a courtesy. "We were expecting to hear from your solicitor," he said, to Marcus. "My solicitor reviewed the agreements I brought him," Marcus said. Miss Cordelia prepared them. She did not wait for another objection. She opened the folder and began. She presented for 22 minutes. She did not argue. She did not advocate. She laid out the supply agreement analysis with every supporting figure, walked through the proposed revisions and the documented cost of the existing arrangements, and presented the comparative estate data in the sequence she had arranged it, not dramatically, but in the order that made each point land before the next was introduced, because that was how evidence worked. At the 8th minute, Greaves leaned forward and asked a question about the methodology for the regional comparison. She answered it with the specific figures she had used and the source for each one. At the 14th minute, Whitmore asked about the timber agreement damages clause. She explained it in 2 minutes and cited the 3 late deliveries by date and documented cost. At the 19th minute, Aldcroft said nothing, but wrote something in his notebook, and she could see from the angle of his hand that it was not a dismissal. Lord Farnwick said, at the conclusion, "This is a thorough compilation. I am not certain, however, that the board requires the analysis of a household dependent in making its investment decisions." The room did not erupt. There was a long suspended moment. She looked at him. She did not straighten her spine because her spine was already straight. She said with the particular precision that was her primary instrument in every situation, "What the board requires is accurate and current information about the Ravenswood estate's management position. I have provided that. The figures are verifiable. I have included the source documents for each. If you would like to have a solicitor verify them, I would suggest beginning with the timber agreement which is attached as Appendix C, and the comparative estate data in Section 4, which comes from the county agricultural records that are publicly held. She paused. I have provided what is true. What you choose to do with it is the board's decision. Greaves said, I find the analysis satisfactory. Whitmore said, as do I. Aldcroft looked up from his notebook and said, the figures in Section 4 resolve a question I have had about the northern parcels since last spring. I would like a copy of this document. Lord Farnwick was silent. He was not a foolish man, despite what the last 22 minutes might have suggested. He was a man who had been operating on an assumption that was no longer supportable, and he was intelligent enough to know it, even if he was not yet willing to say so aloud. Marcus had been standing at the side of the room for the entire presentation. He had not spoken since his introduction. Now he walked to the table and stood beside Cordelia, and he looked at Lord Farnwick and said, I should like to be clear about one thing. The investment decisions for the Ravenswood estate are mine. The analysis on which they are based is Miss Cordelia's. If the board has a concern about the quality of that analysis, I suggest we address it now, because I have no intention of replacing it with something less accurate in order to satisfy a concern about its author. He did not kneel. He did not kiss her hand. What he did was stand beside her in front of 5 board members and make it entirely plain that her work and his judgment were the same thing, and that he was prepared to defend both of them together. The room understood this. It was not a romantic gesture in any conventional sense. It was something older and more considered than that. The room was changed. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing, and the people in this particular room were, one by one, beginning to understand it. Viscount Crowe cleared his throat and said that he thought the presentation was very thorough. Lord Farnwick said nothing at all. The partnership agreement went forward to a final review. She walked out of Farlington House into the cold December air and stood at the top of the steps for a moment, holding her folder, while the other board members dispersed behind her. Marcus came to stand beside her. She was not going to pretend she did not feel the weight of what had just happened. She was also not going to perform it. She pressed one hand briefly against the front of her folder and released it. Section 4 was the strongest part, she said. Section 4 was built on 2 nights' work, he said. Yes, she said. Most of the strongest things are. He was quiet for a moment. The cold was absolute, and the gray December sky sat low over the gravel drive. He said, I should like to ask you something, but I am not going to ask it here. She looked at him. All right. They drove back 14 miles in a silence that was entirely different from the silence on the way out. It was the silence of 2 people who know something has shifted and are allowing each other the time to understand it properly before it is named. He asked her that evening, in the library at Ravenswood. She had come to Ravenswood 3 weeks earlier, her position as a state consultant, formalized by a contract that Mr. Roper had drafted, and she had revised once, adding a clause that specified the scope of her professional independence. Marcus had read the revision without comment and signed it. He asked her in the library in front of the fire that had been lit an hour before she arrived, which suggested the fire had not been lit for accident. He asked her to sit, which she did, and he stood for a moment, and then apparently reconsidered standing and sat as well, which was so uncharacteristic of his usual contained authority that she felt something shift in her chest like a stone settling onto firm ground. I intend to propose marriage, he said. I am aware that the form of the thing requires me to speak to Lord Ashworth first, and I will do so, and he will agree, because he will see the practical advantages, and because he does not, in the end, disagree with anything that costs him nothing. What I want to say to you before any of that is what is actually true. She waited. Not because it is convenient or appropriate or fitted the requirements my position imposes, he said, but because you are the most competent person I have encountered in my adult life, and because you told me what you thought about the timber agreement in a library when you had your shoes off, and had no reason to be anything but honest, and because you presented before 5 board members without a single moment of performance, and because you fixed my cravat without ceremony, and without expecting anything for it. He paused. And because the estate at Ravenswood has been, for 13 years, managed by a series of competent men, none of whom I have trusted, And because you are the first person since my mother who has looked at it and understood what it needs." She held his gaze for a long moment. She thought about it completely, which was how she approached everything that mattered, not from fear of the answer, but from respect for it. "Yes," she said. He looked at her, as though he had not entirely believed she would say it, despite everything. She found this genuinely surprising about him. He had concluded things about her from evidence and acted on those conclusions with remarkable steadiness. It had not apparently occurred to him that she might have done the same. "You did not hesitate," he said. "I did not hesitate," she agreed. "I thought about it. There is a difference." Lord Ashworth gave his agreement without difficulty, as Marcus had predicted. He said, "Well, she's always been useful," which was the warmest thing Cordelia had ever heard him say about her, and she accepted it for what it was and did not require it to be more. The announcement was made in January. Miss Hartley, upon hearing it, said very little in public and rather more in private, which was the socially acceptable architecture for her response, and which Cordelia did not begrudge her. The Earl of Farnwick said nothing that was directly recorded. Sir Edmund Farrow said a great deal that did not signify, because the partnership agreement between the Ravenswood estate and the Northern Agricultural Investment Society had been finalized the week before, and the paper trail from Cordelia's supply agreement analysis was now well enough established that Sir Edmund's alternative narrative had no surface to adhere to. Viscount Crowe, at a dinner in February, told the gentleman next to him that he had found Miss Cordelia's presentation at the December meeting rather more thorough than he had initially anticipated. He said this in the careful tone of a man making the minimum possible acknowledgement, and the gentleman next to him nodded, and neither of them looked at the woman across the room who had produced the presentation and was now the Duchess of Ravenswood. The wedding was in April, at the Ravenswood Chapel, small and specific, with Mrs. Timmins in the front row and Mr. Roper looking unexpectedly moved in the second. She wore a cream dress that she had chosen herself. She had her shoes on. The years that followed were built in the particular way that two people who are accustomed to building things from first principles tend to build them, carefully, specifically, with attention to what was actually needed rather than what was expected. The estate at Ravenswood was reformed over 3 years, the supply agreements revised in their entirety, a new arrangement with the tenant farmers established that replaced an informal system with a documented one, documented the way Cordelia documented everything, with dates and figures and annotation, the reasoning recorded alongside the decision, so that the record was not just what had been done, but why. Marcus managed the estate's wider affairs, the investment decisions, the parliamentary business, the county relationships, with the same contained strategic quality he brought to everything. He and Cordelia worked in the same room most mornings. He did not consider this a domestic arrangement. He considered it the correct and most efficient use of what they each had. Their son, Henry William, arrived in the winter of the 3rd year. He had his father's stillness and his mother's habit of looking at things twice before deciding what he thought about them. He learned to walk by pulling himself up on the estate office shelves, which were, by that point, reorganized into a system so well documented that 3 neighboring estates had sent their own stewards to copy it. The estate office system became something larger. By the time Henry was 3, Cordelia had been asked twice by landowners in the county to review their own supply agreements. She had done so. She had then been asked to advise on tenant farm documentation practices. She had done that too, and written a brief guide, which circulated first through 5 estates and then through 12, and eventually reached a publication by the County Agricultural Society, attributed, because it was 1854 and certain forms were immovable, to the Ravenswood estate management practice, rather than to her name. But the annotated copy in the Ravenswood library, the working draft with her hand in every margin, and the original timber agreement still tucked into the back cover, said in her own handwriting at the top of the first page, C. Ashworth, revised for general use, January 1852. On the evening in late autumn when Marcus found her rereading the guide for some purpose she did not explain, he stood for a moment in the doorway of the library watching her. The fire was high. Henry had been put to bed an hour ago, but had escaped twice already, and the sound of small footsteps above suggested a 3rd attempt was in progress. which Cordelia had clearly decided she was going to allow to reach its natural conclusion before intervening. She had not heard him yet. She was reading with the complete absorption she had always brought to things that mattered. He had been watching her for years. He had watched her present before a board and revise a contract and fix his cravat and tell him, with perfect precision, what he had cost himself by not reading his own timber agreement. He had watched her become the thing she had always been, which was the most competent person in any room she entered, now in a room she had built herself. She looked up. She saw him watching. She did not perform anything about it. She set the guide on the side table and said, "Henry is attempting the stairs again." "I know," Marcus said. "I heard him. He is going to make it to the landing this time. Probably." She stood and smoothed her skirt and walked past him toward the door, and as she passed, she straightened his lapel with 2 fingers, a small habitual gesture that had replaced the cravat as the domestic signal of everything she had decided he was worth, and went out into the corridor to retrieve their son from the stairs. He followed. The landing light was warm. Henry, caught halfway up the staircase with the expression of a small person who has been found but not yet decided to surrender, looked at his mother with a face full of intent, and she looked back at him with the particular stillness that was the oldest thing in her, and said, "Not tonight." He came down. She carried him back to his room, and Marcus stood in the corridor and watched the door close behind them, and the house around him was quiet and steady and entirely itself, and that was the whole of it. That was the life.